Hey, Aaron, right now.
Hi folks, today we are in Savannah, Georgia, and we're going to take you specifically to Fort Pulaski. Also, there will be some aerial views of Fort Jackson as well. After the War of 1812, the United States was in need of some protection against future foreign incursion by sea. President James Madison asked that a series of coastal forts be enacted. One of those forts that was built in the early 1830s by a very gifted engineer, a young Robert E. Lee, was named Fort Pulaski. Its namesake, Count Casimir Pulaski, a young Polish nobleman and brilliant cavalry officer, he being mortally wounded in a bold attempt to retake the city of Savannah from the British, a city that they would control through most of the war. The fort would play a vital role in the safety of the country for nearly 30 years, when in 1861, the Civil War would break out. Used as a Confederate base, it would be held as an attempt to stave off the Union naval blockades, which were trying to take over most of the southern shipping lanes.
At the mouth of the Savannah River, Fort Pulaski stands as a monument to military engineering. Its massive walls echo a reminder of the changing nature of warfare. Under cover of night, 11 batteries, each bearing the name of a northern hero, were erected on Tybee Island opposite the fort. Lighting their way by candle and lantern, speaking only in whispers, the men hauled the heavy guns through the mud on sleds and carriages that required as many as 250 men pulling drag ropes. Just before dawn each day, all work was camouflaged. Seen from the fort, the landscape appeared completely unchanged. On Cockspur Island, the Confederates worked to make the fort battle-ready. The men were aware of nighttime work on Tybee, but did not realize the extent of the work by the Union soldiers. The final armament count on Tybee consisted of 36 pieces, including mortars, standard smoothbore Columbiads, and the James and Parrott rifled guns.
The Confederates inside of Fort Pulaski thought that they could withstand anything that the Union could offer. And for the most part, they were right. For nearly 2 months, they had held out against the siege. But these rifled Parrott guns would prove to be too much. In fact, the undoing of the fort would simply be technology. New technology that the fort could not withstand. Knowing this and hoping to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, the Union commanders wanted to avoid the battle before it even started.
In his hand, a formal demand for immediate surrender. Colonel Olmsted responded.
Sir, I have to acknowledge receipt of your communication of this date demanding the unconditional surrender of Fort Pulaski. In reply, I can only say that I am here to defend the fort, not to surrender it.
At 10 minutes past 8 that morning, Gilmore gave the order to commence firing. The first shot was a mortar round that arced slowly over the fort and exploded in the air. Confederate shots were fired from the casemate guns. Soon, the upper guns joined in, directing their fire at Kings Point. Private L.W. Landershine, a member of the Oglethorpe Light Infantry, recorded the following event in his diary.
About 10 o'clock, the halyards of our flag was cut by a fragment of shell. Lieutenant Hussey from the Montgomery Guards and John Latham of the German Volunteers went through a perfect shower of shot and shell. Getting the flag, brought it round and raised it on a temporary staff and put it up on the northeast corner of the fort.
Only a few Confederate shots scored hits on the well-entrenched Federal batteries.
Whenever the boys on the ramparts would see a good shot made by anyone from the fort, you could hear them give cheer after cheer.
In the afternoon, fire from both sides slackened. By the end of the day, Union forces had expended over 3,000 rounds, but from Tybee, Fort Pulaski appeared nearly as solid as it had been when battle had begun.
And although the Confederate troops would love to have agreed with the initial assessment by Union forces, their eyes told a different story. The Union shelling from those entrenched Parrott guns had taken a heavy toll on Fort Pulaski. The fort would not last. Most of its defenders would be captured. Upon taking control of the fort, the Union soldiers would repair the damage, and Fort Pulaski would serve the Union Army as a prison camp for Confederate forces. The cemetery at Fort Pulaski boasts those of workers, of soldiers who were here in the early days of the creation of the fort in the 1820s and 30s. There were bodies of Confederate soldiers, Union soldiers. The Union soldiers would later be moved from here after the Civil War. There are some graves that mark some of the early inhabitants of Fort Pulaski, including one infant child, and a grave marking the immortal 600 Confederate captives that would be held here that were said to be of the toughest stock. They were admired both by their people as well as the Union officers that were here. Fort Pulaski would continue to serve its country over the years. It would have a regular component of civilian workers and soldiers stationed. It would be a staging ground and a training ground for World War I. But in the late 19-teens into the early 1920s, Fort Pulaski had, for the most part, fallen into disrepair. And the decision had been made to transfer the fort from the War Department to the National Park Service. And into the late 20s, into the early 1930s, under several of FDR's works programs, we would see a lot of the initiative that we see to this very day that reclaimed the fort and built it into the monument that it is today, to those people that built this, that defended the country, that fought a civil war, that prepared for a world war, and it can be enjoyed for future generations. One of my favorite parts of the fort here, you can see as we go around it, the moat and then the drawbridge here in front of the fort. And to be as old as it is, approaching 200 years in fact, it's still pretty amazing to look at. Getting a glimpse of what it was like to live and work in the fort. We're here in the quartermaster's area, where the supplies would be kept, inventoried, protected to make sure that this could be a well-oiled, well-running machine. And we have a chapel where the religious life of the crew here would be maintained. Religion obviously playing a large part in keeping the morale up. Moving further through the fort, we see the doctor's area and the various tools of the trade at the time. We move further into the officers' quarters. Not bad at all. Moving through the inner workings of the fort, you get a glimpse of just how big everything was, how big the corridors had to be to move these ammunition on carts back and forth between the big guns as they were trying to defend the fort or trying to repel enemy ships, which was why the fort was put in the first place. Amazes me too when you think about the soldiers in these thick wool uniforms a lot of times, even in the hottest parts of the year, trying to keep these munitions constantly moving, constantly firing. We see some examples of some rare sling carts that are original to the fort, where not only would you move these big artillery pieces back and forth, but for the Confederates, they would move large pieces of wood that they would use as further protection from bombardments. For the Union, they were using these sling carts on Tybee Island to move pieces around, but it was very hard trying to move these heavy pieces of machinery through the sand. It would take over 200 soldiers actually to move these items back and forth. Really in awe of Fort Pulaski because of how well it's maintained. It is this rare glimpse, this rare opportunity to look back in time and get a sense of what the men and women who lived here, a little bit of what they went through. And of course, Fort Pulaski, for those that may not know, Pulaski, Tennessee is nearby from me. It's not home, but I spend a lot of time in Pulaski. And it, yes, was also named after Count Casimir Pulaski. So now I've been able to say that I've been to the two most famous monuments, two most famous namesakes to Count Casimir. One of the things as you're walking around here, the Rangers will tell you to watch. There is not a lot of railings, and in some spots it would be very easy to fall off. You've just got where you're standing and then water in front of you and open field behind you. And I've seen some other YouTubers who have done videos of Fort Pulaski of showing them kind of getting lost. It's easy to. It's a massive complex here. And again, my favorite part, the drawbridge here in front. You can really see here the shelling, the bombardment that the fort took from the Union. And the major point on the end there has been patched over. But it was after seeing how much damage that had been sustained that they knew, essentially the Confederate side knew that they were not going to be able to withstand much more. And not only is this a tourist attraction because of his historical component, but the fort is actually used in movies. It was used in The Conspirator that was directed by Robert Redford. And then oddly enough, it was used in Abraham Lincoln versus Zombies. If you didn't see that one, I'll understand. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this. We really enjoyed going to Fort Pulaski. Have a great day, everybody.